Bible College. It's a delight to have you on our campus. I'm Ken Daughters, the president of the college. Our Intercultural Studies Department especially welcomes you as they are the sponsor of this dialogue. Why this kind of structured dialogue? Well, a dialogue presents a unique opportunity to consider an issue in a way that is orderly and concise. As each of the experts presents his case, we, the audience, have the opportunity to think on our own, come up with our own questions, as well as our own conclusions. The question we have before us tonight, as you know, is the Quran or the Bible? Which is the scripture of peace? You know, in the country tonight, as we are heading into the elections, many of us are interested in which candidate might best help us achieve peace for our country and as much as possible in the world. You know that our world has been filled with wars and rumors of wars. Perhaps one of the things that you crave most is peace. As you have studied the world's religions, have you found religions that call and promote peace? Our dialogue today will be moderated by Dr. Paul Jensen. Dr. Jensen has been teaching philosophy and religion at the University of Dubuque for the past 6 years. Prior to that, he taught at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, and was adjunct professor in the philosophy department at Loras College for 4 years. 3 years ago, he joined the faculty at the University of Dubuque as a full-time professor. He holds a PhD in philosophical theology from the University of Virginia and a JD with honors from the University of Iowa College of Law. He's practiced law in Iowa and Illinois for the past 10 years with a law firm of Hammer, Simon, and Jensen. He also graduated from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School with an MDiv and a THM, and North Park College with a BA. He's a member of the Society of Christian Philosophers and the Dubuque and Joe Davies County Bar Associations. We're delighted to have Dr. Jensen as our moderator tonight.
President Daughters, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. It is my privilege to be with you tonight and to serve as the moderator of this dialogue. The first principle of dialogue is this: before you can say you disagree, you must first be able to say that you understand. And so my hope tonight is that by listening to our two distinguished participants, when we are finished tonight, you will be able to say, I understand better. Now, I'm going to give you an outline of how this dialogue will proceed. I will also explain to you that we are going to ask some of you, perhaps all of you, to participate by writing down questions as you listen to the participants. And I'll explain to you the rules dealing with those questions in just a moment. Then I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight, and the dialogue will begin. So, here is how we're going to proceed. We have two representatives of two of the three world's great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. We are going to begin with Mr. J. Smith, who will give a 20-minute presentation, followed by Mr. Inam Ul Haq, who will give a 20-minute presentation. Then Mr. Smith will respond to Mr. Haq. Mr. Haq will respond to Mr. Smith. They will each be given 5 minutes for their responses. Then we will take a very brief, probably 60 second to 2 minute interval when we will sort of reorganize ourselves and collect questions that we hope you have written. And I'll give you now the rules for those questions. Some of you, perhaps all of you, have a 3x5 card with you. And we ask 4 things. Number 1, you need to write on your card to whom the question is addressed. That needs to be first. Second, it has to be a genuine question. It cannot be a statement of opinion. In other words, we're asking you to put a question that you don't know the answer to and that you hope one of the participants does know the answer to. Then we ask that those questions be passed to the aisles. They will be collected and brought up to me. We've set aside only 20 minutes for questions. We have some questions already, which we will start with, and then we're hoping that you will give to me questions which I will then choose to give to the participants. The participants will then have 2 minutes to respond to the questions. So the last thing that your question must be is a question which can reasonably be answered in 2 minutes. There will be a 2-minute answer followed by a 1-minute response from the other participant. With 20 minutes for questions, we will have time for roughly 7 questions. At the end of the question period, I will announce that the question period is over, and then each of the participants will have a final opportunity to do a 5-minute summation. Mr. Haq will give his 5-minute summation, and then Mr. Smith will give his 5-minute summation. Now, you may be tempted to applaud at various times, and we're asking you not to applaud at all until the very end when I invite you to thank our participants. Listen, think, write questions, and learn. All right. On my left is Mr. J. Smith. Mr. Smith will be representing the monotheistic religion of Christianity. Mr. Smith was born in India and has spent most of his life in India, but he is an American citizen. He is presently pursuing PhD studies in London, England, where he is studying pursuing Islamic studies in London, England. Because he was born in India, has familiarity with both Eastern and Western worldviews. He is an acknowledged authority on matters Islamic, and he has participated in debates with some distinguished people, including Iqbal Siddiqui, editor of the Crescent International magazine, Ismail Muhammad, the son of Elijah Muhammad, founder of the Nation of Islam, and the late Benazir Bhutto, the former Prime Minister of Pakistan. On my right is Mr. Inam Haq. Mr. Haq presently is a professor at Elmhurst College. Prior to that, he was the principal of 2 Islamic day schools in Chicago. He has been interviewed by the media, including the Chicago Tribune and PBS, and he's frequently consulted on matters Islamic. Mr. Haq was born in Pakistan, but has lived in the United States since the early 80s and is an American citizen. We're going to begin tonight with a 20-minute presentation from Mr. J. Smith.
Professor Jensen, I want to thank you for your introduction. Professor Huck, thanks for showing up and for doing this debate. It's going to be great. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Now, why are we doing this debate? Well, we both realize that both Islam and Christianity claim to be religions of peace. Yet, as we look at the world today, we see an enormous amount of violence around the world. Both religions use Scripture, not only for their authority, but they go to Scripture to support what they're going to do, and that's one reason why we have looked at this debate and we've zeroed it on Scripture. The Quran for the Muslims, also to that would be added the traditions, the tafsir, which would be the commentaries on the Scripture, the Sirah, which would be the biography of the Prophet Muhammad as a paradigm, and then, of course, the Hadith, his sayings, in the Tahriq, which would be the histories of all mankind up until the time of the Prophet. For Christianity will be the New Testament, and I say New Testament rather than the Old Testament because it's the New Testament that we follow. It's the New Testament that we model today in the 21st century. Both religions also use a model, and I would suggest for the Muslims it's Muhammad. He is their model. For us, it's Jesus Christ. Now, we also use a context to understand Scripture. For the Muslims, it would be Asbab al-Nuzul, which would be the content, the content not only of the Quran, but the context from which the Quran was written, following the example of the Prophet himself, the Prophet Muhammad. For the Christians, it would be biblical exegesis that is based on not only the life of Jesus Christ, but also on the commentaries from Paul and the letters that he wrote later on. But both religions also use what we call progressive revelation in applying that context. And when you look at the progressive revelation between the two different halves of the Quran, you will see that the Meccan surahs revealed between 610 and 622. The Medinan surahs revealed between 622 and 632, the last 10 years of the Prophet's life. When you look at the context there, you will see that there is a reference to peace in the Meccan surahs that move into much violence in the Medinan surahs. So it goes from peace to violence following the life of the Prophet himself. When we look at the scriptures, we'll find that the Old to New Testament, the Old Testament is full of violence. Lots of violence in the Old Testament, but when you come to the New Testament, when you come to the reference to Jesus Christ and his model, you'll find it is one of peace. So we go from violence to peace, the other direction. And then, of course, it is here, with these two contexts, that the comparisons become problematic. And the reason I say that is this. The Quran follows the life of Muhammad, and so is revealed in these two periods. In the Meccan period, the prophet was only just that. He was only a prophet. He was not a statesman. And therefore, he, in some ways, lived in a very minor, in a very majority environment. Therefore, he could not use violence. It's when he moves to Medina in 622 that things begin to change. And you'll see the revelations start to change. And you see what he did in his life start to change. He takes on the role of a statesman. And as a statesman, he then incorporates or even creates what we know as the Islamic State, the Khilafah. According to some dates, was incorporated in 624. And from that time on, as a statesman, the laws and institutions that were imposed or that were brought about are problematic for us, those of us who are living today, because it's that model that many of my friends, many of my Muslim friends are now looking to. Many of those friends that I have to deal with in London, the more radical Muslims. Jesus, on the other hand, was not a prophet, was not just a prophet who had estates. In fact, we don't have any reference to a king or a kingdom that is based on the model that we see in the Quran. We know that in the Old Testament, you have the Mosaic model that's very symptomatic, very similar to what we see in the Quran and certainly in the life of Muhammad. But he did not bring in any theocratic state. That was something that was Mosaic, but it was not in the life of Jesus Christ. In fact, if you want to look at a kingdom, Christian kingdom, the closest I can come to is what I see in Matthew chapter 18, verse 20, where he says, where there are 2 or 3 gathered in my name, there I am with you. The kingdom defined as such is not a place, nor is an institution, it's a relationship. It's a relationship between man and God. And that's the state we're looking at. And it's found everywhere. In fact, it's right here in this room. I would venture to say, if you look at the last 2,000 years of our history, you will see that that state, that theocratic, it's not a theocratic state, that relationship has grown fastest when under persecution or in crisis. And it's a completely different paradigm than what I see being created and being evidenced in the Prophet Muhammad's experience. Christ said, when he was asked who he's to pay taxes to, he says in Matthew chapter 22, verse 21, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God those things that are God's, separating the state and the church. And it is that has become the ideal. It is that has become the paradigm for us today. We have tried to use that as best we can the last 2,000 years. We've done terrible at times, and I think in the case of Constantine in the 4th century, when he brought the church and state together, all the problems began. And in Christianity, when the state and the church are brought together, then you start seeing violence. And if you look at the history of the church and you look at where the violence has been found in almost every case, it was carried out by the state in the name of God. But nowhere do I see that in the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, why is that important for us today? While the Quran goes from peace of Mecca to the violence of Medina, the Bible goes from the violence of Moses to the peace of Jesus. Now, if that sounds contradictory, in the Quran there is a reference to or a alleviation for this contradiction, and that's called the law of abrogation. In Surah 2, Ayah 106, in Surah 16, Ayah 101, you have this law which instigates and stipulates that there are two conflicting verses or verses that are in opposition. You always take the later verse. The first verse, the earlier verse is called mansuk. The later verse is called nasik. Mansuk is weak, nasik is strong. Law of abrogation is imposed in the Quran so that when you have these conflicting verses or when you have these conflicting ideas, you always go with that which comes later in the Quran. And of course, as you well know, it's the Medinan surahs that come later in chronology. And it's the Medinan surahs that you will find these verses. My radical Muslim friends in London always point that out to me, and they say the law of abrogation therefore gives much more importance to the Medinan surahs, and when you look at them and you start to unpack them, verses like Surah 9:5, Surah 47, Ayah 4, Surah 8:39, I could go on and on. There's about 149 of these verses. When you start to unpack them, you start to see the difficulty for Muslims today if they're going to use the Quran as their authority. And they have to use the Quran as their authority, as we have to use the New Testament as our authority. Christians are to follow the New Testament. Then we should not be surprised, since we are to follow the New Testament, that as we look to the New Testament as our authority, where you find the peaceful paradigm, and really I'll venture to say that you won't find anything that is violent in the New Testament, and if you do, please show me, and when you look at the violence, look at the context, and I'll show you what the context is. When you look at that context in the New Testament, and when you compare it to what we see in the Medinan surahs, there's not much comparison. But obviously we need to go back to the Old Testament, and we need to go and ask what's going on there. Why was there so much violence? And why is it we're not to use that today? When we look at the Old Testament, you will see that there is a reference to shalom, peace. And what's interesting is when you look at the Old Testament violence, you will see that in almost every case, God participates in that violence. Exodus chapter 7 to 12, you'll find that the plagues in Egypt, that's where God participated in that violence. Also with the walls of Jericho in Joshua 6. Holding back the sun against the Amorites in Joshua 10, or bringing down rain on the Canaanites in Judges 5. And then things start to shift. In Judges 7, then, we see that there is a confusion brought amongst the Midianites as Gideon goes in with those, the least capable warriors, and what's interesting, a battle doesn't ensue. Amongst the Philistines in 1 Samuel 17, with Goliath, by virtue of the stone destroying or killing Goliath, a battle didn't ensue after that time. In 2 Kings chapter 6, with the Arameans, a blindness comes upon the Arameans, and again, no battle ensues. With the Assyrians who come to attack Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 19, it's the angel of the Lord that comes down middle of the night, destroys 185,000 of the men. So when Sennacherib wakes up the next morning and sees his army has been decimated, there is no reason for a battle. He goes home. He goes home defeated, but no battle has ensued as well. And then in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 22, you'll find that the Easterners are ambushed, but they fight amongst themselves. They don't fight for the enemy because of this. And you can see in almost every one of these cases, you'll see a dissipation of violence. And as you look at the Old Testament, you'll see that they're looking towards, and it's moving towards, when the Prince of Peace will come. There's an emerging righteous kingdom that comes about in the Old Testament, looking towards that time when the Messiah would come. In Isaiah 9, verse 6 to 7, it talks about a time where there'll be endless peace, justice, and righteousness. In Jeremiah chapter 23, verse 5 to 8, that the people will live in security and confidence at this time. And then in Micah 4, verses 6 to 13, it talks about the hope for the weak and the marginalized. All of them are anticipating a ruler which will sit on the throne of David, who will bring about peace. And who is that ruler? He is called the Messiah. Interestingly, Muslims should know that because in the Quran, there are 11 references to the Messiah. He's called the Al-Masihu. And only Jesus is given this title, uniquely is given this title. The very Messiah that the Jews are still anticipating, that man, that person who will be anointed to say, but who will bring about that peace, that era of peace, we then find in the New Testament. And when we move into the New Testament, we will find the word irene, that idea of peace, that state of peace, opposite of war. And when you look at the verses of the New Testament, you'll see it's a whole litany of verses that talk about peace. And we can go on and on almost all night talking about it, referring to these verses. Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers. Matthew 5:39 to 44, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Matthew 22, you shall love the neighbor as yourself. Matthew 26, probably the best verse that I know. In fact, it's a great scenario, and many Muslims have thrown that at me. They say there is violence, and there is one case of violence, and you will find it in the Garden of Gethsemane when Peter takes the sword and cuts off the ear of the servant to protect his his Messiah. And of course, at that time, what did Jesus do? He took the ear, put it back onto the servant, turned towards Peter, and said, "Put away your sword, for he who lives by the sword dies by the sword." I thank God for that verse, because that underlines exactly what Christ came to do. As the man of peace, as the Prince of Peace, who was promised in the Old Testament, when he brought about peace, he wouldn't even let those, his disciples, defend him with the sword. And nowhere do you find Christ ever using the sword. Though he was hated, though he was persecuted, though he was whipped, though he was finally crucified, how did he respond to those who crucified him? There we see him on the cross, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Nowhere does he use the sword to defend himself. Nor does he allow those around him to use the sword to defend themselves. 2 Corinthians 13 is the chapter of peace. Live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. Colossians 3:15, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. 1 Thessalonians 5, live in peace with one another. 1 Peter 3, seek peace and pursue it. 1 Peter 3 again, husbands must love your wives and never treat them harshly. Ephesians 5, we can go on and on. There are so many verses I could go to, and that's one of the reasons I love to come back to the New Testament. And that's one of the reasons I say, if you want to find peace, you better come on home. Because Jesus over and over again teaches us that we are not to use violence. Instead, we are to suffer. We see that in Matthew 5, verse 38 and 39. Instead of vengeance, we are to forgive. In Matthew 6, verses 14 and 15. In Luke 17, verse 3 to 4. And instead of greed, we are to share. In Luke 12, verse 33. Also, Luke 18, verse 22. Instead of domination, we are to serve. That we find in Luke 22, verse 24 to 27. Instead of hatred, we are to love. Matthew 5. Now, there are some problematic verses that we need to deal with. What are we going to do where it says in Luke 19, verse 27, where Jesus says, bring them here and kill them in front of me? I've been asked that many times by my Muslim friends. When you look at the context, you will see this is a parable of the last times. In fact, it's a parable of a king who is now telling his servants and sends his servants out, and how they come back to him, and those who don't obey him. He says to those people, bring them here and kill them in front of me. He's talking about basically the end of time, where violence will come again. We see that in the book of Revelation. What about the temple cleansing, where Christ goes and overthrows the tables? There's violence. We find that in John chapter 21, we find that in also Mark chapter 11, and in Luke chapter 19, and John chapter 2. But when you look at that, you will see the violence was not used against people. The violence was used against the animals. In Luke chapter 2, verse 13 and 17, it even says that specifically. So nowhere do we see Jesus using violence against other people. It was interesting. It was the authority of his voice, the authority of his word that drove out the money changers. He didn't need to use violence. I find it interesting when you look at the example of the Apostle Paul, who was first Saul. When you look at Saul, he was a man who did use violence. In fact, he was right there at Stephen's stoning. He held the clothes while he was watching Stephen be stoned. He was a man who was on his way to Damascus to bring the Christians in chains. He was a good Jew. He was from the Shammai school who did believe in using violence. And yet when God met him in a dynamic way there on the road to Damascus, look and see how Saul became Paul. And we look between Saul and Paul, and you ask what was the difference between these two individuals? Same man, but what had happened? What was different? You'll see that not much had changed. He still was a man with passion. He still was a man who knew his scriptures. He was a man who could go and confront with the best, with the Epicureans and the Stoics there in the Areopagus. He could go into the synagogues in Laodicea, Cappadocia, Berea, wherever he went. There in Ephesus, he was able to go, and he was able to there take on the Pharisees there in the synagogues. But what did he not do? Nowhere did he use the sword again. Never needed to use the sword. What was the difference between Saul and Paul? One man used the sword. The only difference I can see between Saul and Paul was not only did he understand Scripture more fully and interpret more correctly, but he never used the sword again. What about the Crusades? What about the Inquisition? What about these historical cases where the church has used the sword? Whenever I'm questioned that, and whenever that's brought to me, I look at the person who's questioning me, and I say very quickly, who is it that I'm supposed to follow, and what is it I'm supposed to do when I'm asked a question like that?